So I'm sitting here next to a pile of parts that I'm going to use to build the next section of the airplane, or rather to go through the next section of the plans. It's basically going to be me beefing up the forward fuselage area where the passenger and pilot are going to sit. Normally I don't start filming until after I have all these parts processed, they're all primed and basically ready to be assembled. But this time I figured, why not make a video on how I go through and process these parts? I did that in some earlier videos, but it's been about 3 years since I've made some of those videos. I've been working on this airplane for way too long. And anyway, I've learned a lot in the last 3 years, and I think I'm better at it than I used to, maybe not. I'm definitely fatter, but that's not important right now. Anyway, so when you get these parts, most of the parts that you get are, by and large, fully formed. I'll talk a little bit more about that, but for the most part, they're fully formed. They've got a protected blue film on it. And so the first thing you need to do is just take off some of the blue film. That's not typically very hard, and it doesn't take too much time. And in fact, it's kind of fun. There is one issue when I was first looking at building an airplane. A lot of people made a big deal, or they seem to make a big deal about pulling plastic off of some of the larger parts, like the skins and things like that. And they invented ways of doing it, like using a roller and all that. And I thought it was going to be way more of a problem than it turned out to be. As it turns out, this stuff just comes right off. So if you're dealing with some of the bigger stuff, you just pull the plastic off. It's not a big deal. After you've got the plastic pulled off, typically the first thing that I do is I just deburr everything. So in the manufacturing process, typically there is oftentimes a little bit of burrs left around the holes in the edges, and you need to file those or grind those down or just kind of get rid of the burrs. Typically I start deburring holes. Well, actually I start deburring in no particular order, but I'll describe first now how you deburr the holes. Typically you use a deburring tool. You can use a little handheld thing like this, which you twirl around in the hole, and I did that for about 5 minutes of my build before I went out and bought a kind of a screwdriver. And at the end of the screwdriver, have a deburring tool. So I typically put these in each of the holes, give it a quick twirl, and that gets rid of the burrs. I also have another deburring tool on a longer shaft, and I can kind of switch these out really quickly. The longer shaft is useful for getting at things where either pushing this in would give it too harsh of an angle or something like that. Anyway, this is also useful. So that's the first thing I do, is deburr some of the holes. The next thing I typically do is go about deburring all the edges. The edges often have a burr along those. And so to do that, I mostly use a polishing wheel. This is useful for large parts. You can get things done really quickly. If you go to most of the aircraft supply stores that supply tools for building kits, they'll have a wheel that's a little bit harsher and then a softer wheel. I've actually found that I like the softer wheel a lot better. And as you can see here, the softer wheel is also a lot smaller because I tend to use it the most. Anyway, so that's kind of my workhorse there. To get around small edges, to get in some of the finer cracks where I can't get the deburring wheel, I'll usually use small files like this. Usually, when I first started doing this, I was a little bit more aggressive with how I would do the filing. Now I find all you need is a quick little swipe, and that's typically enough to get rid of the burr. Another tool I use for deburring is this little tool right here. It kind of has like a little knife edge on it, and you can kind of twirl this around in lightning holes and other areas. And it gets the burr off pretty good. I like this tool. Finally, the deburring tool that I use most is going to be a grinding wheel with kind of like a 3M, or a grinding tool, air grinder with a 3M pad on the end of it. Goes like that. I'm finding I use this thing more and more and more throughout the build. In fact, I probably use it the most at this point in time. I found it's really, really nice to get edges. I can go through and get a lot of edges, especially on large pieces of skins and things like that. It's too hard to put those to the grinding wheel or the polishing wheel. And you can actually use this thing to deburr rivet holes as well. And one of the nice things about using this to deburr rivet holes rather than the whatever that thing's called that I first showed you, the deburring thing, the nice thing about this is it doesn't leave a chamfer in it. You have to be careful when you use that deburring tool, because if you're too aggressive, you can actually start to chamfer the hole. You don't want to do that. This thing doesn't do that. So I'm finding that I use this a heck of a lot more. Another thing you have to do when preparing parts is you often have to machine countersink holes. Typically you're going to do this in thicker pieces of metal where you can't dimple, and you want to use a flush rivet. So to do that, I have basically machine countersink dies that I have in these cages that lets you set the depth correctly so you don't countersink the hole too deep or too shallow. I actually have 3 of them. So one I have permanently set up for a 3/32 rivet. I have another one permanently set up for a 1/8 rivet. And then I have a third one that I can kind of pull in, switch out the machine countersink heads as needed. And these are for like screws and things like that. So I found that setup's really useful. It's a pain in the butt if you're moving between different types of holes you're countersinking and having to constantly reset it. So I like this setup where I have, especially for the 3/32 1/8 rivets, those are so commonly used. It's nice to not have to reset this cage up every time I want to countersink 3/32 holes or 1/8 rivet holes. Finally, there's a lot of parts that you need to kind of cut before you can use them, like this guy right here. This guy, I need to separate these parts. I typically do this with a saw, and then I'll go to a sander and the polishing wheels to kind of fix everything up. Other times, like with these guys right here, you're gonna have to, they have largely preformed parts. These ones have some pressed bearings in there, but I'm gonna need to cut this out right here. So I'll typically do that with the saw as well, a bandsaw, and then I will polish these things or finish it up with the sander, belt sander, and the polishing wheel. So I have all the parts prepped in the sense that everything's deburred and all of that. All the parts that need to be cut and separated, all that kind of stuff, it's ready to go. So I'm gonna assemble this thing, kind of do a mock-up, a dry run, to see how the whole thing fits together. Also, I'm gonna check and make sure that I didn't miss anything, there's no parts that I'm missing, and things like that. Oftentimes the plan will have you assemble things and do final size drilling, even though now most of the holes are already final sized. And so sometimes I skip it, but most of the time I like to put everything together just to see how things fit. So I'm gonna do that next. I can already tell that there's some things that aren't supposed to be machine countersunk until the next section. I'm probably gonna do some of that countersinking now. And yeah, so I'm gonna start assembling this thing and we'll go from there. Okay, I just put this thing together and now I see what I'm about to build. It's kind of nice to be able to see that. I like putting these things together. Anyway, this section went together pretty easily. No real hitches. There were some parts that I needed to adjust the fit and finish on a little bit, but just a little bit. There wasn't too much of that. For the most part, again, this thing went together just fine. It was kind of cool. I got to use all 4 different types of Clecos in putting this together, or more specifically, all 4 different Cleco sizes. So normally I use the copper and the silver colored Clecos. Those are the most common Clecos I use for rivet holes. But in this one, I got to use some black and gold colored Clecos as well for some of the screw and nut holes. So that was kind of fun. Also, in my next step, I'm going to take this thing apart and I'm going to machine countersink all the holes the plans call out for. Not just in this section, which is section 28, but also the countersinking that's called for in section 29. I think way back before these planes or these parts were all final size drilled, you would wait until the next section when you final size drill some of these parts next to skins and things like that. They would probably have the plans required that you wait until that stage to countersink. But now that they're all final size drilled, I'm confident that I can countersink now without any issues. The reason why I'd rather countersink now is it's so much easier to countersink individual parts when you can hold them, and they're small, rather than trying to fit a countersink cage in some of the tight corners from a completed structure like this. So I'm basically going to get all the countersinking done in this section and next section. I'm going to do it now. Also, one last thing, and something I thought of as I was doing this, and I'm glad I did, is eventually you are going to have to put these steel weldments inside here and attach it to the back of this spar. These steel weldments are what holds the landing gear, and they absorb a lot of force when the plane lands. Anyway, the holes in the spar are very precision, they're very precise. The holes in these steel weldments, not so much, especially when you account for the fact that there's some powder coating inside the holes. If you waited until later to put these weldments in, and when you went to try to put the bolts in, you'd find the bolts aren't going to fit. And I can't imagine trying to work with things once this is all put together. Long story short, before I put this spar on, and I didn't film this, I attached these steel weldments to the spar, and I made sure that I could put bolts through each of the holes. And when the bolts didn't fit, I used a reamer to ream out this steel part right here. I used a 3/16, 1/4, and a 5/16 reamer corresponding to the 3 different size bolts that are in the steel weldment. Also, in the bottom of the fuselage down here, there's a hole in the fuselage or a hole in the skin to let this sticky outy thing come out, and that's where the landing gear comes out. The hole is undersized. I opened up that hole a little bit so this thing would fit perfectly. It's so much easier to do it now than later. I don't think you put these steel weldments on for another few sections in the plans, and the thought of having to do everything later, that would be a real pain in the butt. I'm so glad I took care of this now. When the plans do call for me to put this thing in, or these 2 steel weldments, it's going to go in super easy without any issues. The holes are already the right size and all that, so it'll be a lot easier to put these in later. I'll still have to what's it called, tighten the nuts, and it's kind of a tight space, but can't do anything about that. Anyway, so what I'm going to do now is take this thing apart, do the machine countersinking, and then I'm done for today. I'll resume this video when it comes time to prime. I'm not going to film me doing the countersinking. I just don't want to do it. So next up is me taking these parts, priming them, and then I'll be ready for final assembly. Okay, it's been a few days and I've actually gone through and primed everything that I need for this section. So I fortunately took some videos of me doing the priming. I don't usually do that because it's kind of a pain in the butt to deal with the primer and film. Well, it's not too hard, but I just don't like to do it. Anyway, I can kind of talk you through my priming process. So first, let's talk a little bit about primers. I use for 95% of the build, and what this green color is, it's from a primer made by AkzoNobel. They're a paint company. And this particular primer, a lot of builders use it. It sticks to aluminum really well. It's a 2-part epoxy primer. It's really, really resistant to corrosive chemicals like acetone and things like that. In fact, you can scrub acetone on here and you're not going to get any of the primer off. Anyway, that's the primer I use for most of the build. It's a 2-part epoxy, very toxic, and I spray it outside. I'll talk more about that in a second. Before I get more into the Akzo Nobel, I use some other paint. I use this Rattle Can Easy Coat by SEM. I use this for touch-ups or for some small parts that the HVLP gun will just blast everywhere. And it's pretty convenient. Sometimes if I find that I kind of miss a spot somewhere, I'll hit it with some SEM. This stuff is pretty good. When it comes, and then for the interior surfaces, or at least some of the where your feet are going to go down by the bottom, I use this Rust-Oleum matte hammered black paint. I've seen other people use this on an RV before. This particular one is used by another YouTuber, Austin Menke, and I like the Rust-Oleum. It's pretty nice for a couple reasons I like it. First off, it's really easy to make it lay and look uniform. Like here is a paint job that I painted a floor pan, for example. It's very forgiving in the sense that it has kind of a textured surface. And so unlike some other like satin finishes and things like that, where you really have to be careful of how you spray it down, it's really get a uniform looking finish. And so I like that aspect of it. I also like the fact that if there's a scratch on the interior, I can always go to Home Depot and buy this stuff and do touch-ups really easily. So that's nice too. On the downside, this paint is probably not very resistant to scratches the way some 2-part epoxies might, some more expensive coatings. But I like the fact that I can buy it, do touch-ups easier, and it's forgiving to use. So that kind of outweighs it. Plus, as a practical matter, most of these interior surfaces are going to have carpet on them. So most of the surfaces where I spray this stuff, you're not going to see it anyway, so it doesn't really matter. Anyway, so those are 2 of the Rattle Can paints I use. Let's bring it back to the Akzo Nobel. So the Akzo Nobel stuff is really good. It's basically a 2-part epoxy. I didn't take any video of this, but basically you mix 2 equal parts by volume in your paint cup, and then you kind of shake it up and then you let it sit for half an hour. And so what I do while I'm letting that sit is I first go set up my paint stuff outside. Now what I'm using to paint on is I've made kind of a wooden frame. I ran chicken wire over it, and I put this on top of 2 hobby horses and kind of a canvas thing on the ground to kind of protect my driveway. And then that's what I paint on. After I have that set up and the Akzo Nobel is still within that 30-minute window, or at least I have to wait at least 30 minutes. Then I start going out and I start scuffing up these parts. If you spray the Akzo Nobel, it does grip the aluminum pretty well, but it won't grip it very well if the aluminum's very smooth and shiny. So basically you have to mechanically agitate the metal. I use a couple different Scotch-Brite pads. The maroon pads that everybody used, I tried those, but I've found that the gray Scotch-Brite pads or the gray 3M pads, they work a little bit better. They're a little bit finer, more equivalent of something like 400 grit sandpaper. I'm not sure if that's accurate, but it's a little bit finer, and it makes it easier to agitate to scuff up the finish on the aluminum parts. What you're going for when you scuff it up is you just want to kind of scuff it up so it has a nice satin finish. The big parts like skins are nice and easy to do. Basically, my process is I kind of go back and forth across the whole thing, then I go side to side across the whole thing, and then I kind of just go nuts and go in circles everywhere. And what I'm aiming for is to kind of make a nice satin finish. And I found that as long as you mechanically agitate the part and then spray the Akzo Nobel on it, it sticks really, really well. I have tried doing other things like adding spraying it with pre-coat and stuff like that. Some people will really go nuts and iodine the parts before they spray it, and that might be good to do on exterior parts. It might even allow the paint to grip a little bit better, but these are all interior structures of the plane. They're not going to see a lot of weather and wear, and from what I can tell, it sticks to the aluminum just fine. It's really, really hard to scuff it off. Anyway, mechanically abrading, the large parts are pretty easy. What gets to be kind of a pain is when you have parts like this and you have to scuff up the insides of delicate, intricate little parts, and that can be a little bit of a pain. That takes a long time. Actually, when it comes to priming this stuff, the scuffing up of the parts, that takes by far the longest time. Anyway, after I had the parts scuffed up, I simply lay them out on the table that I have, and then I spray. Spraying to get the right thickness. I did have a little thickness meter that I used at the beginning of this build, and after I would spray the parts and let them dry, I would kind of see how thick it was. But now I have a good sense for how thick I'm laying things down, and I don't tend to use that very much. One thing I think is, at least what I sometimes do, is I'll sometimes put a little Sharpie mark somewhere on it, and I try to paint it so I can just barely see that, so it's just a little bit translucent. I don't want to put too much of this stuff on because it's expensive, and I guess it also adds marginally to the weight of the plane. But I found that as long as you can just barely see a Sharpie mark, that's about where you want to be in terms of thickness. Anyway, after I spray the parts, I just let them dry. And it's a summer day, I can handle the parts within 10, 15 minutes, definitely within half an hour. Right now it's about 55 degrees outside. You can spray this stuff down to about 45 degrees. And then it takes a little bit longer for it to dry enough to where you can touch it. Then I bring the parts inside, and because I want my wife to always know that I'm building a plane in the garage, when it's cold outside, I typically lay the parts all over the house, usually over the dining room table, and I kind of let them cure. Usually I'll wait at least 24 hours before I do anything with them. I do prime the parts before I dimple. I do that for a couple reasons. First off, it will, after you prime the parts and then dimple, it'll make sure that the dimple is the right dimensions, although that's a minor concern. The bigger issue is that if I spray this stuff after I dimple, or rather if I try to mechanically abrade it after I dimple, it's really hard to mechanically abrade inside the dimple holes and things like that. Plus, if you go on the opposite side, it'll really just shred up your 3M pads really, really fast. So I usually dimple after I prime. The only exception is parts like this one that I'm going to spray with either the SEM or some other rattle can primer. I found that those primers are a little bit flakier, they're harder, they don't bend, I guess, with the metal. So if especially with the SEM, if I try to dimple after I spray it with the SEM, typically the paint will flake off. So normally what I do on parts that I'm gonna either hit with the SEM or this Rust-Oleum stuff, what I do is I mechanically abrade the part, then I come in and do all the dimpling, and then I lay it out and paint it after that. Anyway, so that's pretty much it. As you can see, these particular parts turned out fine. And if you are aiming to use primer like this on a build for you, and you're kind of doing your research, a couple years ago I was doing the same thing, and I was fascinated by the priming process. I never sprayed any primer like this, and I wasn't sure how difficult or easy it's going to be, and I tried to look up videos. My apologies if this video doesn't really tell you everything you probably want to know, but let me reassure you, after you spray this stuff once, you'll get the hang of it. It's really not that hard to spray. Very tolerant to mistakes, and really you're not spraying the outside of the plane, so if you get a little bit of orange peel or if the parts aren't totally uniform, it looks just fine, and it works just fine for the intended purpose. Finally, this Akzo Nobel stuff is pretty toxic, so that's why I spray outside. If you are having an interior paint booth, you definitely want to have fans to ventilate this stuff out. I use a 3M full face mask that has, I think, these the most expensive filters you can get to filter out stuff. Although usually if I'm doing it outside, where I live, it's windy enough, it basically carries the fumes away pretty quickly. Also, the HVLP guns will use up air pretty quick. I have a 5 horsepower, a Quincy QT54 compressor, and that tends to keeps up very well with the spray gun. But prior to buying that compressor, I had a much smaller one that you got from Home Depot, and there's no way it would keep up with the spray gun for this. Which is a whole other issue. If you're wanting to build an airplane in your garage, most of the air compressors you can get, like at Home Depot or Lowe's, they're gonna work just fine for almost everything. The only areas where you'll have difficulty with the lower power compressor is either using a grinder or a paint gun like this. On the topic of paint guns, so anyway, the QT54 will keep up with all of that plenty fine, and there's a lot of other compressors that will too. But for doing air drills, squeezers, all that kind of stuff, pretty much any compressor you get at Home Depot will do just fine. Even probably portable compressors will work. But stuff that uses a lot of air, like again, the gun and the things like grinders, yeah, you want a bigger compressor from that. Anyway, on the topic of gun, I use a 3M performance gun with a 1.4, I think it's millimeter. Anyway, a 1.4 nozzle. This is a good all-around system. Some people use cheap Harbor Freight guns. You don't need to buy a fancy paint gun to paint the prime your airplane. You're not looking for like a show quality finish here. And this Akzo Nobel is really forgiving. For the most part, I get really uniform finish, just fine with this. The advantage of using the 3M paint gun is, first, it has disposable nozzles that you don't have to worry about if they get too dirty. In principle, I could throw this away after every use, but I've found that these nozzles seem to hold up pretty well, with no chunks coming out of them or anything like that. And so I typically use them, I don't know, 10 or 20 times in a row. So the nozzle is disposable, and also the 3M system uses these disposable 3M paint cups. So they basically have an exterior component that you see markings on that you can use to measure out how much paint you're going to use. And then there's an interior liner you put in like this, and then there's a filter that goes on top. So what I'm getting to here with the 3M performance gun, this is what I like, is there's basically no cleanup. Because when I'm done, I just take out this liner, throw it away along with the filter cap right here. They're disposable. And if I want to, I can also throw the nozzle away. So the only thing I need to clean on this gun after I'm done is this little pin thing at the end, and I just kind of wipe it off. Actually, when I'm done, I spray through a little bit of acetone through this, then I take off everything, wipe off this needle, put this little styrofoam thing back on it, and that's pretty much it. I just throw away the liner and no cleanup. So anyway, that's it for the painting of stuff. After I have this stuff painted, that's usually when I go through and dimple. For big skins, I use my wife calls, or I call it the R2D2. My wife calls it the R2D2. I think it's the DRD2, something like that. Anyway, I use the DRD2, the R2D2 for larger skins, and then I use my squeezer if I can for some of this stuff like these things right here. Anyway, after that, the thing's ready to assemble. All in all, the prepping of the parts, the fitting of things, the bending, the cutting, doing all that, and then the priming, that actually takes up most of the build time. Actually riveting things together tends to go pretty dang quick, and that's normally what I film, because the processing of parts is kind of boring. You don't get to see something being made. But anyway, yeah, that's it. So I'm ready to put this thing together, and that's what I'll do in the next video. But yeah, this is how I process parts, and it's pretty repetitive. You do it for every single section, for everything you see that has green paint on it and is dimpled. Yeah, I went through and processed it before I did the video. Anyway, so that's it for now. In my next video, I'm gonna put all these parts together and finish section 28, or whatever section is that I'm working on. I think it's 28. Anyway, that's it for now.